happening. This is we love getting returning in champions here on the Craftsman Online podcast as we welcome back worshipful brother Ted Cross. He's the past master of the Arizona Lodge of Research, and this time we're going to go into the Masonic mind on the Craftsman Online podcast. Welcome back, brother Ted.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
So you were joining us earlier this year, and we had a great episode on the science of happiness. And it's funny, I'm sure I've shared this with you. I've shared this with our listener. We record this, and then I edit this, and then months, sometimes weeks later, it gets released. And that's when I actually get to listen to the episode when I'm out running or working out. And so I'm like really listening to that one, and I was like, oh, that was so fascinating. So we're going to make sure that the link to listen to that episode is in there. But mainly, Brother Ted goes inside of our minds and kind of helps us understand feelings and how we can associate them with Freemasonry and this experience that we enjoy with being a Mason. So let's get back to kind of that mode there. You were talking about in your psychological assessment, like some of the core differences between Freemasons or Freemasonry versus, let's say, like the Rotary Club, an Elks Lodge, maybe a hobby club or some other group. What is different about the craft experience?
Well, first, I'll say that it has a lot of similarities that do lead to happiness and flourishing. And that's kind of what we covered last time, which was Martin Seligman, the father of positive psychology, talks about this PERMA model: positive emotions, engagement, relationships, meaning, and achievement. And you can really see that a lot of those sort of features are also inside of lots of different types of clubs. You can get together and create meeting. You can have positive relationships. You can find positive emotions and activities that create those inside of lots and lots of different types of organizations. But I think that Freemasonry has some real differentiators, and I think that's what we should delve into today, which is it's not just that it's a club centered around rituals and symbols. And yes, other groups might have some rituals and symbols, but I would say in Freemasonry, it's so central that sometimes we even say that's what Masonry is that ritual and symbols. We're practicing Masonry, or we're laboring together in the quarry on these rituals. And so, why is that so important? Other organizations have sort of got rid of those. And you even see this sort of in the Scottish Rite, different jurisdictions. Sometimes some are heavily ritualized, and maybe the Northern Masonic is more lightly ritualized in different ways. Like they're showing more of a modern take on those older rituals.
Of the degrees,
right?
yeah.
Yep, of the degrees. So the question is, like, why is that important to have inside of an organization, and what makes Masonry effective in our mission of making good men better through that process?
This is where I feel like we don't help ourselves with the conspiracy wingnuts when we talk about ritual. Just that word. If you're outside of Freemasonry, you're like, what is ritual? Are they sacrificing? No. It's part of the degree process. We refer to it as a ritual. But also inside of that ritual are all the symbols within Freemasonry. And that also, spend enough time on the internet, they'll have you convinced that we were doing all kinds of crazy things. Let's examine this from a psychological standpoint, because I want to get into that point. We talked a lot about the lodge, but there's also the symbolism of like what the lodge represents. And how does all of this come together and shape the individual's experience when it comes to being a Freemason?
I think it's important first to understand that Freemasonry is a treasure trove of symbols and ideas and philosophies that come from all over the place. So um, many Masons want to point to one particular place that Freemasonry originated, but the answer is it's Enlightenment invention that was sort of picking and choosing from the junkyard of history, trying to gather in all those good ideas, and comes through the idea of the Enlightenment. And so they're pulling ideas from everywhere and weaving it into our system of degrees and our philosophies that are powering those degrees and the symbols that are inside of those degrees. So you can find Masonic symbols all over the place that aren't in Masonic organizations. Of course, many of us have seen early Christian depictions that have squares and compasses in them, for instance, and those kinds of things. But the question is, why do they choose those ones, and how do they get into our degree system? And I would argue that it has something to do with our collective unconscious minds, that we have this idea that is evolutionarily, as we have evolved, certain ideas have stuck around with us. And that's why we find similar features across religions, similar features across different cultures, different values and morality systems often tend to share large portions with each other. And many theorists argue that that's because over time we sort of kept the things that work. Uh,
Mm.
and those have emerged sort of organically over thousands and thousands of years. So Carl Jung would call that, well, that's our collective unconscious. Um, that's our collective sort of evolutionary residue that is with all of us. And then biologically, as we have evolved, the first part of our brain was that reptilian primitive brain, which often is what's powering sort of your unconscious mind. And then later we evolved to be more rational, right? And that's one of the things we think is that we're rational as modern humans, but we're really more irrational than we want to believe. And there's a lot of science behind that.
Yeah. So I'm laughing because we are. That's the funny part. We are. I'm also laughing because I can't believe it has taken us this long in 2 episodes to get to this question, which is like the central part of Freemasonry. It's the part that I love talking about. I love when we get brothers and guests that come on the podcast and talk about the brotherhood that exists within Freemasonry. Personally, I feel like I'm never a stranger and I'm never alone whenever I walk into a Masonic lodge. It doesn't matter if it's another lodge here in my home district or if I'm in another state or another part of the country. If I walk into a Masonic lodge, I'm amongst brothers and there's that instant bond. That's how I feel like internally. I'd like to get your examination of that, the importance of that feeling of belonging that comes and maybe some of the deeper elements that kind of create these connections.
Yeah, there is a real brotherhood, I think, in Freemasonry. And of course, there's sort of practical reasons why that's important. We talked about relationships and having positive relationships in our last episode and how that increases longevity, health, and happiness, but also provides psychological safety. When you have people that you can trust and talk to when things happen in your life, as they do, you have something to rely on. They've even done studies that show that people rebound from illness faster. That actually give people like a muted flu virus and see if they're sort of in a community whether or not they heal faster. And the answer is yes, they actually do. And so
Mm.
it's a protective thing. They also have found that folks who experience trauma that have better community connections or close relationships also tend to fare better and be able to go through their trauma rather than sort of really falling into depression. Not that you won't get depressed, but that you can rebound a little bit more easily because of those relationships you have. So brotherhood really is important. I think our rituals and our symbols create a common language for us to share with each other. So if we think about Robert Putnam's idea of social capital, and there's two kinds, there's bonding social capital and there's bridging social capital. Bonding is the glue, the social glue. So how do you bond to each other? And that creates in-group cohesion. So a very strong in-group and group identity. And then bridging social capital is like the WD-40 of social capital. It's the how do we make sure that things are smooth across different groups? So Freemasonry is interesting because it brings people from disparate backgrounds together. And it says, let's adopt this common degree work, rituals, symbols, and narrative to bond us together, but it's bonding together people from different walks of life. So it builds both bonding and bridging. The problem with, for instance, in my religious tradition that I come out of, has tons of bonding culture. There's rituals, there's things, but even though we say we are friendly to outsiders, we're a little bit not as open as we probably should be to outsiders. Where Freemasonry can say, we're going to take people from various faith traditions, philosophical and otherwise, and bring them together. And we're not asking you to sort of commit to anything that is so radical philosophically, right?
Mm-hmm.
The morals, we'll talk about the four cardinal virtues in a minute. these things are kind of basic, but let's join together on those. And I'm not going to ask you particularly your theology or your dogmas you believe in. We're going to leave that out, and we're going to try to go to some common ground.
It's interesting. I just got back from vacation, and well, at the time of us recording this episode, it's September, so I just got back from vacation. By the time it airs, I think it's scheduled for a release in December, so listeners are going to be like, where'd you go on vacation? Anyways, so during that, I was having a conversation in a cigar lounge with a couple guys, not Masons. We were talking about Freemasonry, and one of them was like, "Oh, I hear there's a lot of religion in Freemasonry," and he was a very religious and spiritual person. And I'm like, "Yeah, it's woven into our degree work, but it's not necessarily what Freemasonry is all about." And so we started having that conversation of, your acceptance of faith being challenged. That's something that we mentioned in the New York ritual in the first degree. And we were having a really interesting conversation about just the different traditions and the cultures that are out there. And I realized during this conversation that my friend was really kind of just staying focused on, he was very into Christianity, where I was talking about Buddhism and some of the other Eastern principles and philosophies. And it was just fascinating because I would have never been exposed to any of these other ideas or thoughts if I hadn't met these other unique, cool men in Masonry that we kind of come together, as you say, with the concept of being like-minded.
Yep.
And I feel like this is one of the, I don't want to make this like a pitch session here, but it's one of the things we don't talk a lot about in the craft that does kind of go back to your Science of Happiness episode that you talked about, that there is this longing to belong and being connected. As human beings, we have that just burning in us. Some of us, it burns a little hotter than others, I'd say.
Yep.
But regardless, that's one of the things, the brotherhood, we don't talk a lot about that in Freemasonry. Although I think for those that do come to visit a lodge, it's visibly on display. You can tell that these guys are friends, that they hang out outside of the lodge, that they know each other's families. They know what matters and what's meaningful to these other men in their lives because they're Masons and they have spent time together.
That's right. I mean, a couple of years ago, my wife ended up having to go to the ICU. She went septic and she was on death's doorstep. And I called my lodge members and asked them, would you guys say a special prayer in stated meeting for us, when they joined around the altar at the end. And that was really meaningful to me because I knew that they were thinking about me. Now, can you get that with your religious group and others? Sure. But it's a bit different for guys. Sometimes we don't make friends as much. There's lots of research that shows that married couples who retire, if the woman happens to die first, which isn't statistically often, men often fare poorly because their social connections are gone, because it's the woman who actually does all these things and sort of coordinates a lot of these things, which is, I don't know if it's nature or nurture. It's probably more socialized than we want to admit, sort of these gender roles. But I think Freemasonry can provide sort of a historic and safe organization for men to build friendships and show vulnerability in a way that feels like these guys aren't going to put my news on blast. We sort of make promises about that inside of our degree work, right? And so there's something about confidentiality. There's something about secrecy that isn't nefarious, but it's rather about keeping the confidence of others, sort of in a Alcoholics Anonymous sort of way, right? That is like, I'm going to keep your secrets not because you're doing something wrong, but because I'm your friend and I'm going to be here to support you, and you have people to support you. I think that's very useful.
Agree. And also, worshipful, a first. We have never had a brother drop news on blast on the podcast yet. So congratulations. That's yours now. That's your honor. Right. But no, to what you're saying, I was thinking about it. I was like, yeah, my poor wife, like she's got 5 sisters. So all of the times that we hang out with her side, it's always her family. She's got 5 sisters and her close network of friends. All of the people that we hang out, people on my side are basically all Masons. And it's not because I only just want to hang out with Masons. It's because of all of the things that you're saying. I know these guys. I like being around these guys. They're all completely different than each other. Like the one thing that unites us, well, besides being men, is that we're all Masons. Some of us aren't even in the same lodge. We just all like hanging out and we enjoy each other's company, and we can talk about anything and try new restaurants, go places. I would love to go on vacation with my brothers at some point, because to all the things you're saying, like next to family, they're the second most people that I trust as a group in life, which is pretty powerful. So
Yeah.
I guess kind of back to that one point where we talk about the brotherhood and the psychological impact. And it's kind of like, for me, similar to you, that it's the Charles Dickens story. It was the worst of times, but then the best of times. When I joined my mother lodge in New York, I was going through my divorce, and I decided at the same time to go back to school. So I was completely at a high stress level. I joined a Masonic lodge and instantly had this new, like, plug-in group of friends and brothers. Now, when I say instant, it wasn't like, oh, we all became best friends overnight, but I started having the roots that have grown the seeds for the trees, which are now in the forest of friends that I have.
Yes.
And I love that about Freemasonry.
That's right.
To your point, when you have your highs and lows in life, as we close our lodge here in DC, one of the traditions our master has is he has us go around the room and we give a high and a low. And it's interesting because we only meet once a month. And so you can hear guys talking about work struggles, family struggles, life struggles. And it's quiet. No one speaks. There's no real reactions unless somebody has a funny joke. Then, we laugh about that. But to hear another man just open up and be so vulnerable, I can't even tell you, outside of maybe sports teams, was the only time I ever heard men communicate like this.
Yeah. So I think that brotherhood is a huge feature. And I think going back to your question about how does the symbols and degree work sort of root their way into our psyche and help us change, I kind of want to return to this idea of our conscious and unconscious selves.
Sure. Yeah.
The idea seems pretty simple, but it was pretty revolutionary when Freud and Jung started talking about these things, like you have a conscious self and you have an unconscious self. And Jonathan Haidt recently gave a good analogy that our conscious self is like a rider on top of an elephant, and our unconscious self is the elephant. And lots of times we think our job is to control the elephant, but the answer is we can't control the elephant. We have to figure out how to work with the elephant. And if we can figure out how to work with the elephant, we can access all that unconscious psychic energy, which is probably driving us anyways, even though we don't think it is. And there's lots of experiments that show that we make decisions based on emotion, not on logic. For instance, they did an experiment where they gave people popcorn that was seasoned with some bad tasting stuff. And they gave people bad tasting popcorn in a small bucket and bad tasting popcorn in a big bucket. And they weighed it before they sent them to a movie and after. And the people who got the bigger bucket ate more bad tasting popcorn than the ones with a small bucket. It's the same bad tasting popcorn. It's not logical that you would eat more because it's in a bigger bucket, but you do, right? So we're like influenced by things that are not logical. And one of those things is our unconscious mind. So the question is, how do you get access to the elephant? If that's what's driving a lot of our behaviors and a lot of our emotions, how do you connect with that? And there's a guy named Daniel Z. Lieberman. You should have him on the podcast. He wrote a book about sort of our unconscious and fairy tales, folk tales, and symbols. And he argues that the mediator between our unconscious mind and our conscious mind are stories and symbols, basically. And that symbols, because of what we talked about earlier, are part of our sort of evolutionary heritage, our common heritage. That's why they are able to access that primitive part of us. So we see these symbols in these stories, and that's why, Masonic story and narrative is not really historical, but it's effective, right? That's the point. It's not, did it happen? It's how is it affecting and what does it mean to me? So you have these symbols. You can imagine it sort of like our unconscious is this huge reservoir of water. And if we don't regulate it well, then you get overwhelmed with a fountain squirting up and, sort of blasting you, and it's too much. Whereas if you're balanced, there's nice water coming out. And if you're starved, there's none coming out. And the mediator is that fountain, which is like a symbol or a story or a fairy tale that helps us access that. That's why, you know, some brothers are into tarot or astrology or things. These are archetypal symbols that have existed for thousands of years in different forms, you know, different sort of formats, but they help us access that unconscious mind and help us to then make changes in our lives. The more we avoid that unconscious part that's driving us, the less likely we are to get what we want.
I want to talk a little bit about with you, Brother Ted, on the idea of making a good man better, because we talked a lot
Yes.
about like the individual. And as I shared previously with you, because I was like, oh, yes, another Arizonan. So I grew up in Yuma, which is, well, at the time it was a tiny town. It's gotten a
Yep.
little bit bigger over the years. But there's not a lot of diversity in Yuma, Arizona. Not that there's anything wrong with it. I'm sure it's like any other small town anywhere across the US. What's really interesting that I find in Freemasonry when we talk about that group dynamic is we do talk a lot about making a good man better. You know, there's a lot of personal development, personal growth that
Yes.
goes into it. And it's heavily the backbone for us is that ethical framework that definitely exists in all of our Masonic ritual. But can you touch on kind of the power of the group and being around others and that exposure that helps with self-help or character building within the individual, the benefit of being in that group dynamic?
So Aristotle would say that character cannot be formed outside of a community. So it's not an individual pursuit. And his idea of a sort of reaching your telos or your mature, ripe state, your end state, your reason to exist, was to be a good member of society, right? So that's what he's aiming at: flourishing human beings and flourishing society. And so the behavioral science is starting to show that. Certainly, we know there's experiments, for instance, that on average, you weigh close to what your best five friends weigh. They've even done experiments where they've put, I had, this was a professor in one of our business schools the other day was telling us about an experiment she did where she wanted to see what influenced food choices for students. And one of the biggest influences was, what is the food that everyone around you at the lunch table was picking? You'll do that. You might have experienced this at a restaurant, like, oh, they're gonna get the cheesecake. Okay, I'll get the cheesecake. Like there's these, so the group influences us. And the way I think about this is, you know, I grow these little bonsai trees over here. And if there's a problem with the bonsai tree where it's starting to look yellow or something, I don't go shake the bonsai tree and say, what the hell's the matter with you? You start growing correctly. I look at its environment and I see what is wrong with the environment that is causing this thing not to flourish. And so the community that we're planted in is all the difference.
It's interesting. Steve Harvey, of all people, the guy who's the new host of the Family Feud,
Yes.
he has that same line. He's like, if you have three friends who smoke, guess what? You're going to be the fourth person that smokes. If you have three friends who are broke, guess what? You're going to be the fourth friend who's broke. It's so true. Like who you associate yourself with, it does affect the person you become, or it projects to the person that you're going to become.
That's right. We also know that, for instance, that big brothers and big sisters is actually the best intervention to keep kids off drugs. I don't know if we mentioned that last time, but that's the only one. That's one of the only interventions we have data on, right? And that's because there's this. It's a role modeling thing, right? Young kids get to see an adult maybe outside their social circle that is modeling different behavior maybe than they are experiencing at home, and because of that, they can sort of, oh, maybe there's a chance I could act like that, or I could be like that, or I could have this kind of potential too.
I want to talk about the power of going through our degree works and how that shapes you as a Freemason. We've seen it in ourselves. We may have noticed it. It's more noticeable, I think, in other people when you see, you know, a guy who's interested in joining Freemasonry. He comes and petitions a lodge. He gets accepted to join the lodge. Boom, he gets his first degree, and he gets that first dose of like Masonic lessons or teachings, right? What is the impact or the progressive nature of being a Freemason going through these degrees? How does that structure help build a man?
Well, from a pedagogical or andragogological standpoint, like a learning standpoint, it is scaffolded, right? So it starts with some basic lessons in the first degree, then it gets into some more complicated things about the liberal arts and sciences in the second degree, and then the third degree is about your own mortality, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so it's this progression from can you manage your life? Think of the 24-inch gauge, you know,
Mm-hmm.
common gavel, like how do you manage yourself just practically to how do you cultivate your mind, and then how are you thinking about your sort of eternal self and mortality. And all through that is this idea of reflective process, and this idea that you should be rethinking and re-examining yourself all the time, with the assumption, I think, that you're probably wrong at different points. And
Hmm.
similarly, the degrees also progress from giving you not basic knowledge on one symbol to increasingly um, elaborating on that symbol. So you're starting to see, I'm a novice. I haven't joined the lodge yet. There's a checkerboard I'm walking on. Well, that's not a checkerboard. That's called mosaic pavement. Why is it called
Mm-hmm.
that? Okay, so there's a lot of curiosity, and then it builds on itself. Oh, my checkered life, my checkered past, I'm standing on white and black at the same time. Right? There's all these ideas that start coming about and building on each other from. I guess you could even say it's a hermeneutical progression. When you analyze a text through hermeneutics, usually the Bible, for instance, there's the literal interpretation, the allegorical interpretation, and then there's sort of like the esoteric and spiritual interpretation. And you can go through those three levels looking at the degree in different ways. I come at it from the psychological often, like in some of the religious perspectives, but you might interpret it in different ways. But there is a scaffolded approach, I think, through those degrees that's effective.
We've talked about the significance and the importance of symbolism, the ritual, the community of brothers that exists within Freemasonry. Stop me if you've heard this expression before, that every man can be a Freemason, but Freemasonry might not be right for every man.
Yep.
In your experience, Brother Ted, has there been any kind of profiles, or maybe if that's not a great word, like personality traits that you find that would be drawn to Freemasonry that would be a good fit? And then on the other end are those types that are out there, those personality profiles that just might not be a good fit to join a lodge?
Yeah, I've had a lot of thought on this, particularly your phrase, about Freemasonry being for every man, but maybe not for a particular individual. And
Mm.
someone put it to me this way: um, Freemasonry is for everyone, but not every lodge is. And
Yeah.
so I've settled on that as my philosophy. However, I think you're right. There is something to guarding the West Gate that we talk about, and this idea of who is part of that circle that's going to influence you, as we mentioned before.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so I would say, my opinion is one of the prerequisites to become a good Freemason is to be curious, want to learn, and to change. Uh,
Yep.
we're not here to stay the same. We're here to learn things. And then from a psychological perspective, the most validated personality model is OCEANS, which stands for openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And those are the 5 dimensions of personality. I would say we have a mix of all kinds of people that come to the craft, but a lot of them are high on openness, like they're open to new ideas. You mentioned
Mm-hmm.
being able to think about Eastern religious philosophy and Western religious philosophy and not have your head explode, or you know get mad at others because they don't think the way that you think. There's that openness. I would say I put in my notes last night when I was preparing for this. Probably the ritualists have a lot of conscientiousness in them. They're very conscientious. They want to make sure things are exact. some of the past masters, I'm just joking, probably have some neuroticism in there, right? So for some of those things.
Right. That's funny. So I jotted down three things because I was like, I'm curious if we're going to match up on this. I think the one quality, and this is just in a random order, is, to your point, intellectually curious. If you are an intellectually curious man, you're going to enjoy Freemasonry. It's two words. I wrote good heart and also trust. If you're someone that others say, oh, he's a good person, you can trust this person, Freemasonry is probably going to be a good fit. The other one is one that I came across recently listening to another podcast when we talk about service to others as Freemasons. And the example, and it played out for me several times, and it does all the time, where I grew up in Arizona. So when I see a door that's closed and there's a woman that's behind me, I open it for her and I let her walk in front of me, and then I walk behind. And if there's another guy walking, I leave my arm out so the door stays open and doesn't slam shut in their face. That's right. Just how I was raised. Now, I don't do that because I'm expecting them to say thank you. It's really weird too when people are like, oh wow, people don't do that anymore, thanks for doing that. Like that's and I'm like, everybody should be doing that. That's where I think of like service to others, where it's like, I'm not doing this to get a thank you from you. I'm doing this because you're another human and I want to not see you being suffering in any kind of way of the word suffering. So yeah, to those points, I think those would be the three qualities that would make for a pretty good Freemason, if that's something that's inside of your heart. I got a couple more questions with you, Brother Ted, before we close up this episode. We've talked a lot about Freemasonry, what it does for individuals, how it brings men from different stripes, different faiths all together. When you look at Freemasonry as a social organization, and I think about this all of the time, especially in this, we've always lived in a divided country, but also one that has a lot of extremism now in this modern era, where we don't have trust, not only in our neighbors or our leaders, but also even in technology or the information that we're given. Where do you see Freemasonry's role or our strength in the challenges that exist right now today?
Well, I think you're right that our civic infrastructure, both physically and metaphorically, is at an all-time low. This is why Robert Putnam, our social capital guy, is, doing his 25th anniversary of his book and created a film called Join or Die, which is literally like, if you don't join these kinds of organizations, your longevity is going to be less. But there's also this social capital that we need to have, that WD-40 across different ideologies and groups to build that bridging social capital. So I think things like Freemasonry can be sort of really, really important. It doesn't mean that it's just Freemasonry, and I don't think that Freemasonry is going to see a 1950s resurgence or anything like that, but we need more organizations like Freemasonry for different groups. And I am seeing younger men come to Freemasonry, particularly just small sample size in a couple lodges I belong to here in Phoenix. I am shocked at the quality of young men who are approaching the lodge of their own free will and accord, if you want to say it that way, and investigating. Whereas people my age, 45 and younger, into their 30s, weren't really interested in this, but it seems the 20-year-olds are really searching for meaning. And so Freemasonry is a great place to be. And so we have a chance to, maybe it's not scale, but it's impact on certain individuals who will be part and parcel and leaders in our communities, to be part of these groups that have intergroup contact, as sociologists say, with different ideas, and thus able to hold two different ideas in their mind, like I said, without their heads exploding, which is the opposite of extremism.
Right. Yeah, I've noticed that too. This new generation that's coming in are becoming Masons. I'm always kind of skeptical because part of me is like, okay, well, in 20 years, these are the people that are going to be taking care of me when I'm retired. But I also look to see what do they find interesting in it, because like you, I joined in my mid-30s, so in my home lodge, I was a young man, and now I'm one of the older guys because DC has a much different demographic. but it is interesting to see them coming in because they are intellectually curious, very so, but they also just have this, it's infectious, and sometimes it can be a little annoying, but this great positive optimism that's their spirit. And I find it so entertaining to be around them when they tell stories, and I feel so much better being around these guys when I get a chance to hang out with them, that I like it. It's almost like a honey in a weird way.
Yep. And it is true that emotion is contagious. And so it's nice to have some of these young guys with a positive outlook, which is really interesting considering some of the sort of financial realities of the modern world and
Yes.
the political realities. It's almost probably a defense mechanism, a coping mechanism to say, well, I can either, sort of acquiesce that we're on the slow decline or the short decline, depending how you look at it, or I'm going to try to join some of these organizations, better myself and the community, and it's helpful to us.
Yeah. Let's close out with this question. I hope, and I actually got an email that really touched me a few weeks ago from well, now he's a brother, but he was an Insta gentleman. He found the podcast. He listened to a couple of the episodes. It led him to knock on the door of a lodge, and he just took his first degree. I'm sure by the time that this episode airs, he'll be second and probably on his way to doing his third degree. It makes me feel good to know that the mission that we have here at Craftsman Online is to help connect men who have an interest in Freemasonry with our craft. So for someone who's listening right now that's thinking about it, hey, maybe I want to join. What psychological aspects should they be aware of? Not just from the potential benefits that we've talked about, some of the commitment that's also required, but just things that might be off on the side of the road of their highway of life that you can share from your point of view.
I think practically, I would say find a lodge that fits you, and it's okay to shop around and take your time a little bit and investigate multiple lodges. That's okay to do. One that is, you seem to like the brothers in there, and you hit it off with them. That's important. And then it's important to think that and understand that the degree work is medieval and Renaissance and Enlightenment experiences in a modern day context, which is meant to be jarring, because some people might join and be like, well, this ritual is strange, or maybe they looked it up on the internet or whatever, and they're worried about this. It's meant to teach lessons, and it's designed in a particular way because we've pulled it from the past, and that shouldn't be scary. That could be exciting, right? And then I would say that there's some brothers who come to me who are highly religious in a certain tradition and have heard a lot of bad things about Freemasonry. I've only experienced good things through the degree work and my associations with Freemasonry, and it's broadened my understanding of what spirituality is and understanding of my own faith tradition. And so I don't think that should be as big of a concern, but I know that for different, groups it can be, and sometimes it's useful to, get paired up and talk with the Catholic brother or the Mormon brother like me, or somebody that, or the Lutheran person or whatever that you're, a little bit worried on if you come from one of those faith traditions. And so it's okay to sit down and ask questions to someone who's done it before you and find out about it.
All good points. And hopefully this conversation will lead to a series of conversations for that interested gentleman who's thinking about making one of the best decisions in his life.
Yes.
We can be biased on that one. It's always a pleasure to have you. I hope we can get you back on for another episode in our new season as we look forward to a new year, 2026. Geez, it's crazy that that's on the way. Worshipful brother Ted Cross, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks so much. Talk to you soon.